Declassified. November 15, 1944. The Hurtgen forest stretched endlessly before Sergeant Thomas Cookie Kowalski like a cathedral of death, its skeletal branches clawing at the pewter sky above the German-Belgian border. The morning mist clung to the frostbitten earth with the persistence of a burial shroud, carrying with it the acrid stench of cordite, decomposing leaves, and something far more sinister that every soldier in the 28th Infantry Division had learned to recognize without naming. The temperature hovered just above freezing, creating a bone-deep chill that no amount of wool could chase away, and the silence that preceded dawn held an ominous weight that made veteran soldiers check their weapons twice and whisper prayers they hadn't uttered since childhood. Cookie crouched behind the remnants of what had once been a magnificent oak tree, its trunk now reduced to splinters and char from weeks of artillery bombardment, his calloused hands wrapped around a dented mess tin that had become as much a part of him as his rifle. The metal was ice-cold against his palms, but he barely noticed anymore. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed the hellscape before him, where the bodies of American GIs lay scattered among the fallen timber like discarded marionettes, their dog tags catching occasional glints of the pale morning light that filtered through the canopy above. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of mud, blood, and broken branches that sucked at boots and claimed ankles with every step, while overhead, the constant whisper of wind through damaged trees sounded like the dying breaths of 10,000 ghosts. Through the skeletal forest, Cookie could make out the dark shapes of German positions that had turned this wooded nightmare into an impenetrable fortress. Machine gun nests bristled from every conceivable angle, their MG-42s trained on the few paths that American forces might dare to take. Sniper positions dotted the higher ground like deadly ornaments, while carefully concealed mortar teams waited with mathematical precision to rain death upon any foolish enough to advance. The Germans had been here for months, digging in with the methodical thoroughness that had made them masters of defensive warfare, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every clearing into a killing ground and every fallen log into a potential grave marker. Behind him, Cookie could hear the labored breathing of Colonel Marcus Bradley, a career officer whose steel-gray eyes had witnessed horrors from North Africa to Normandy, but who now stared at the tactical map spread before him with the haunted expression of a man watching his own funeral arrangements being made. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Intelligence reports confirmed at least 400 German defenders dug into positions that had taken weeks to construct, supported by artillery pieces that could range every inch of American-held territory. They were members of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division, battle-hardened veterans who had survived the Eastern Front and knew exactly how to make attackers pay in blood for every yard of ground. The American forces available for the assault numbered barely 250 effective combat troops, many of them replacements fresh from training camps who had never heard a shot fired in anger. They carried standard-issue M1 Garands, a handful of bars, and the kind of determined desperation that came from knowing they were being asked to accomplish the impossible. Previous attempts to break through this sector had resulted in casualty rates that made seasoned war correspondents refuse to file their stories, and the medical corps had run out of stretchers 3 times in the past week alone. What made this morning different from all the others was the growing realization among the command staff that conventional tactics had failed so spectacularly that continuing to employ them bordered on criminal negligence. Direct assaults had been slaughtered before they could advance 50 yards. Artillery barrages had proven ineffective against the deep German bunkers. Flanking maneuvers had been anticipated and countered with such precision that entire squads had simply vanished into the forest without a trace. Even the elite rangers had taken one look at the defensive positions and recommended waiting for better weather, more troops, or preferably both. Yet here they were, facing a deadline imposed not by military necessity but by political reality. The offensive had to succeed within the next 48 hours or risk being called off entirely, leaving this strategic crossroads in German hands for the remainder of the winter. The implications stretched far beyond this single engagement. Success here would open supply lines that could shorten the war by months. Failure would condemn thousands of Allied soldiers to freezing in inadequate positions while German reinforcements poured in from the east. Colonel Bradley's weathered fingers traced the contour lines on his map for the 100th time that morning, searching for some tactical advantage that had eluded every previous examination. His aide, Lieutenant Morrison, stood nearby with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was holding himself together through pure military discipline, occasionally glancing toward the German positions with the expression of a man calculating the statistical likelihood of his own survival. Cookie watched all of this with the peculiar detachment that came from his unique position in the military hierarchy. As the senior mess sergeant for the 2nd Battalion, he occupied a space that was simultaneously essential and overlooked, trusted with feeding 600 men daily but rarely consulted on matters of tactics or strategy. He had spent the past 3 weeks observing the ebb and flow of this particular battle with the trained eye of someone accustomed to managing complex logistics under impossible conditions, noting patterns and inefficiencies with the same attention to detail he applied to meal planning and supply requisitions. But this morning was different. This morning, Cookie had been struck by a realization so simple and yet so profound that he had initially dismissed it as the desperate fantasy of a man who had seen too much death and too little sleep. The idea had germinated during the long, sleepless hours when he prepared breakfast for soldiers who might not live to see lunch, growing stronger with each failed assault he witnessed and each casualty report that crossed his improvised field kitchen. It was an idea born from years of understanding how to feed large numbers of people under adverse conditions, combined with intimate knowledge of human psychology gleaned from observing how men behaved when they thought no one was watching. The plan forming in Cookie's mind represented such a radical departure from conventional military thinking that he had spent days questioning his own sanity. It relied on principles learned not in infantry training but in the kitchens of Depression-era Chicago, where he had learned to stretch ingredients beyond all reasonable expectations and create something satisfying from nothing more than scraps and imagination. It required understanding not just the mechanics of warfare but the deeper psychology of fear, hunger, and human nature that transcended national boundaries and military uniforms. As the first rays of actual sunlight began to penetrate the forest canopy, painting the frost-covered ground in shades of amber and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty, Cookie made a decision that would alter the course of not just this engagement but potentially the entire war in the European theater. He was going to propose something so unconventional, so seemingly absurd, that it might just work precisely because no military theorist in his right mind would ever consider it. The question was whether he could convince his superiors to let a cook with a crazy idea try to accomplish what seasoned infantry veterans had failed to achieve. Time was running out, and in 15 minutes, he would discover whether genius looked any different from insanity when viewed through the lens of desperate circumstances. The transformation of Thomas Kowalski from a Chicago neighborhood cook into the most unlikely hero of the Hurtgen Forest had begun almost exactly 3 years earlier, in a world that seemed impossibly distant from the frozen hellscape where he now found himself. Back then, in the autumn of 1941, Cookie had been just another face in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, where the air perpetually smelled of industrial smoke, bratwurst, and the dreams of families who had crossed an ocean in search of something better than what they had left behind. His real name was Tomasz Kowalczyk, but somewhere between Ellis Island and his first job at Kowalski's family restaurant, the complexities of Polish pronunciation had been smoothed away into something more palatable for American customers and payroll departments alike. The restaurant itself was nothing spectacular by Chicago standards, just another narrow storefront squeezed between a barbershop and a dry cleaner on a street where English was often the third language you might hear on any given day. But within those cramped confines, Cookie had developed skills that would prove far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Working 16-hour days alongside his father Stanislav, he had learned to feed hundreds of factory workers, dock laborers, and steel mill employees with nothing more than creativity, determination, and an almost supernatural ability to stretch ingredients beyond all reasonable expectations. The art of feeding large numbers of people on impossibly tight budgets had taught Cookie lessons that no military manual could provide. He understood the psychology of hunger, how the aroma of cooking food could distract a man from his troubles, how the right combination of spices could make even the most unappetizing ingredients seem like a feast. More importantly, he had learned to observe people, to read the subtle signs of satisfaction, frustration, or desperation that crossed their faces as they ate, and to adjust his approach accordingly. These were skills born of necessity in a neighborhood where customer loyalty meant the difference between keeping the lights on and boarding up the windows. When the Selective Service notice arrived in Cookie's mailbox on a gray December morning in 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor had transformed America's relationship with the world, he had stared at the official letterhead for a long time before opening it. The attack on Hawaii had changed everything, turning abstract concerns about European politics into immediate questions of national survival. Like millions of other young men across the country, Cookie found himself facing a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The war had come to America, and America needed every able-bodied man it could find. His father had taken the news with the stoic resignation of a man who had already lived through one world war and understood the price that history sometimes demanded. "You go," Stanislav had said in his careful English, his calloused hands never pausing in their preparation of the evening's pierogi. "You serve country. Family will be here when you come back." But Cookie had seen the fear in his father's eyes, the same fear that lived in the hearts of parents across America who were watching their sons march off to fight enemies in places they could barely pronounce. Basic training at Fort Bragg had been a revelation for Cookie, though not necessarily in the ways the Army had intended. While his fellow recruits struggled with the physical demands of military conditioning, Cookie found himself adapting with surprising ease to the rhythm of military life. Years of 16-hour days in restaurant kitchens had prepared him for the exhaustion and stress better than any civilian job possibly could. The early morning revelries, the constant activity, the need to perform under pressure, all of this felt familiar in ways that comforted rather than challenged him. Where Cookie truly excelled, however, was in the mess halls. His drill instructors had intended his assignment to kitchen duty as punishment for some minor infraction, talking in formation, perhaps, or failing to maintain proper alignment during inspection. Instead, they had inadvertently discovered a soldier who could transform the standard Army rations into something that actually resembled edible food. Within weeks, Cookie's cooking had become legendary throughout the training camp, with soldiers from other companies finding excuses to visit his mess hall and officers making unusual detours past the kitchen during meal times. It was during this period that Cookie first encountered Master Sergeant William "Bull" Patterson, a career soldier whose weathered face told stories of campaigns from the Philippines to France during the previous war. Patterson had served as a company cook himself during the First World War and recognized in Cookie something that transcended mere culinary skill. "You got an eye for what people need," Patterson had told him one evening as they cleaned the massive cooking pots together. "That's worth more than you know in this business." Patterson became the mentor Cookie never knew he needed, teaching him not just advanced cooking techniques but the deeper principles of logistics and human psychology that separated great military cooks from merely competent ones. Under Patterson's guidance, Cookie learned to read requisition forms like strategic documents, understanding how to requisition supplies in ways that maximized both quantity and quality. More importantly, he learned to view his role not as simply feeding soldiers but as maintaining morale, health, and fighting effectiveness through the careful application of nutritional and psychological principles. The training accident that nearly ended Cookie's military career occurred during his final weeks at Fort Bragg, when a poorly maintained field stove exploded during a combat cooking exercise, sending shrapnel through his left shoulder and leaving him hospitalized for 3 weeks. The injury itself was relatively minor, but the psychological aftermath had been devastating. For days, Cookie found himself unable to approach cooking equipment without experiencing panic attacks that left him gasping and sweating despite the air conditioning in the hospital ward. It was Patterson who pulled Cookie back from the brink of a medical discharge, spending hours at his bedside talking not about the accident but about the soldiers who would depend on him in combat. "Fear ain't the enemy," Patterson had explained during one of those long conversations. "Fear keeps you alive. But you can't let it keep you from doing your job." Through patience and determination, Patterson helped Cookie work through his anxiety, gradually rebuilding his confidence until he could once again stand before a field stove without feeling his chest tighten with remembered terror. The deployment orders to the European theater arrived on a humid August morning in 1943, carrying with them the promise of everything Cookie had trained for and the dread of everything he had tried not to imagine. The 28th Infantry Division was bound for England first, then the continent, with a mission that remained classified but obviously involved taking the war directly to the German homeland. Cookie's orders designated him as Senior Mess Sergeant for the 2nd Battalion, a position that carried tremendous responsibility and virtually no recognition outside the immediate chain of command. The crossing to England aboard the USS George Washington had been a nightmare of seasickness, cramped quarters, and the constant awareness that German U-boats were hunting for exactly such targets somewhere beneath the grey waters of the North Atlantic. Cookie had spent most of the voyage in the ship's galley, helping to feed 3,000 soldiers while fighting his own battles with motion sickness and the growing realization that everything familiar was disappearing behind them with each passing mile. England had provided a brief respite, months of training and preparation in the green countryside of Yorkshire, where Cookie had his first real opportunity to study European cooking techniques and ingredients. The local farmers and village cooks had been generous with their knowledge, teaching him to work with ingredients he had never seen before and cooking methods that dated back centuries. These lessons would prove invaluable in the months to come, when the ability to create sustaining meals from whatever could be foraged or requisitioned would mean the difference between maintaining an effective fighting force and watching soldiers collapse from malnutrition. But nothing in England had prepared Cookie for the reality of combat in Normandy, where he had first encountered the peculiar combination of chaos and tedium that characterized modern warfare. The beaches had been secured by the time his unit arrived, but the evidence of the D-Day landings remained visible in the twisted metal and cratered sand that stretched in every direction. The smell of death hung over everything like fog, and Cookie had realized with crystalline clarity that his war was going to be very different from anything he had imagined during the peaceful months of training. The Hurtgen Forest represented the culmination of everything Cookie had learned about war, cooking, and human nature during his 18 months of combat service. By the time the 28th Infantry Division entered those cursed woods in early November 1944, Cookie had fed soldiers through the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and the grinding advance toward the German border. He had learned to cook under artillery fire, to preserve food in conditions that would have closed any civilian restaurant, and to read the faces of men who were slowly being consumed by the psychological pressure of sustained combat. But the Hurtgen Forest was different from anything that had come before. Here, in this maze of shattered trees and hidden death, Cookie would discover whether the lessons learned in a Chicago restaurant and refined in the crucible of war could solve a problem that had defeated every conventional military solution. The stage was set for an innovation so unexpected that it would rewrite tactical manuals and save hundreds of lives, born from the mind of a man whose greatest weapon was not his rifle but his understanding of what it meant to nourish the human spirit in the darkest of times. The Hurtgen Forest had earned its reputation as the Death Factory, through a combination of geography, German engineering, and the kind of tactical situation that turned military textbooks into works of fiction. Stretching across 50 square miles of densely wooded hills along the German-Belgian border, the forest represented everything that American forces had not been trained to fight in. The towering conifers grew so closely together that tank support was impossible, aerial reconnaissance proved useless, and artillery strikes were absorbed by the canopy with minimal effect on defenders who had dug themselves into bunker complexes 20 feet underground. The German defensive strategy in the Hurtgen represented military engineering at its most diabolical. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Division had spent 3 months transforming every natural advantage of the terrain into a killing field of mathematical precision. Machine gun positions had been sited to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible avenue of approach, while mortars were positioned to drop shells with devastating accuracy into any depression or clearing that might provide cover for attacking forces. Sniper nests were concealed with such skill that muzzle flashes became visible only after the damage had been done, and the network of communication trenches allowed German forces to shift positions without ever exposing themselves to American observation. The men Cookie watched die during the first week of fighting in the forest represented some of the finest soldiers the American Army had produced. The 109th Infantry Regiment had entered the woods with the confidence of veterans who had fought their way across France, but within 72 hours they had lost more men than during their entire advance from Normandy. The 110th Infantry had suffered even worse casualties, with entire companies disappearing into the forest without radio contact, their fate known only when their dog tags were eventually recovered from positions that had been overrun before any distress calls could be transmitted. What made the tactical situation so hopeless was not just the strength of German positions but their depth and redundancy. Every bunker that American forces managed to capture or destroy was backed up by 2 more positions that had been deliberately concealed until needed. The Germans had created a defensive system that could absorb tremendous punishment while continuing to function, like a military organism that grew stronger as it consumed the strength of its attackers. Intelligence reports suggested that the enemy had enough ammunition, food, and medical supplies stored in their underground complexes to sustain operations for months without resupply. Cookie had watched 3 separate attempts to break through the German lines, each launched with different tactics and each ending in the same catastrophic failure. The first assault, led by the 1st Battalion on November 8, had attempted a concentrated breakthrough on a narrow front, massing 200 men against what appeared to be the weakest point in the German perimeter. The attack had lasted exactly 14 minutes before being broken by interlocking machine gun fire that caught the advancing Americans in a crossfire from which escape proved impossible. Casualty rates exceeded 60%, with most of the wounded remaining trapped in no man's land where German snipers made any rescue attempt suicidal. The second attempt, 3 days later, had tried to solve the problem through artillery preparation, with American guns firing continuously for 6 hours before infantry advanced. The bombardment had been impressive to observe, sending massive geysers of earth and splintered timber skyward while the sound of the guns echoed through the forest like continuous thunder. But when the smoke cleared, the German positions remained intact, their defenders emerging from deep bunkers to man weapons that had been carefully protected from the barrage. The infantry attack that followed had been even more disastrous than the first, with German forces now fully alert and positioned to deliver defensive fires that stopped the advance before it could develop momentum. The third assault had attempted to solve the problem through infiltration tactics, with small groups of specially trained soldiers attempting to penetrate German positions under cover of darkness and eliminate key defensive positions from within. This approach had shown initial promise, with several German outposts being successfully neutralized during the first night of operations. However, the Germans had quickly adapted to the new threat, establishing roving patrols and tripwire alarms that made infiltration increasingly dangerous. By the end of the week, more American soldiers were being killed attempting to reach German positions than during the actual attacks themselves. Colonel Bradley's frustration with these repeated failures had become increasingly visible as the tactical situation deteriorated. During morning briefings, Cookie had observed the colonel's transformation from confident professional to desperate commander willing to consider increasingly risky alternatives. The map spread across Bradley's field table told a story of tactical options that had been exhausted one by one, with red pins marking failed attacks and casualty estimates that had grown so large they seemed abstract rather than real. The pressure from higher headquarters had intensified with each failed assault, creating a situation where political necessity began to override military prudence. Division command had made it clear that the Hurtgen offensive had to succeed within the next 48 hours or risk being suspended indefinitely, leaving German forces in control of strategic positions that could dominate American supply lines throughout the winter. The implications of such a failure extended far beyond this single engagement, potentially affecting the timing of Allied advances across the entire Western Front. It was during this period of mounting desperation that Cookie began to notice patterns in German behavior that seemed to have escaped the attention of intelligence officers and tactical planners. From his position in the field kitchen, which had been established in a relatively protected depression about 1,000 yards behind the front lines, Cookie could observe German positions through binoculars during the quiet periods between attacks. What he saw contradicted many of the assumptions that had guided American tactical planning. The German defenders, despite their tactical advantages and defensive preparations, showed signs of stress and fatigue that suggested their situation was less secure than it appeared. Cookie noticed that German patrols followed predictable patterns, emerging from their bunkers at the same times each day and following routes that had become routine rather than tactically sound. More significantly, he observed that German defensive fires became noticeably less accurate during meal times, suggesting that hunger and fatigue were affecting their combat effectiveness more than American intelligence had realized. These observations led Cookie to a startling realization about the fundamental nature of the tactical problem facing American forces. The German defensive positions, impressive as they appeared, were ultimately dependent on maintaining the morale and fighting effectiveness of soldiers who were living underground in conditions that would challenge anyone's psychological stability. The Germans were winning through superior preparation and positioning, but they were still human beings subject to the same basic needs and vulnerabilities that affected soldiers on both sides of the conflict. This insight crystallized into what Cookie would later describe as his crazy pot trick, an idea so simple and yet so revolutionary that it challenged every assumption about how military objectives could be achieved. The plan that began to form in his mind relied not on superior firepower or tactical innovation but on understanding human nature at its most basic level. It required recognizing that soldiers, regardless of their nationality or political beliefs, shared certain fundamental needs that transcended military training and ideological commitment. The key to Cookie's innovation lay in his understanding of how hunger affected human behavior, judgment, and combat effectiveness. Years of feeding large numbers of people had taught him that properly prepared food could influence mood, decision-making, and even courage in ways that most people never consciously recognized. More importantly, he understood how the absence of good food, or the presence of truly exceptional food, could create psychological states that were more powerful than fear or patriotism in determining how people behaved under stress. As Cookie began to develop his plan in greater detail, he realized that success would depend not just on his culinary skills but on his ability to convince skeptical military professionals to trust a cook with an idea that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. The challenge was not simply tactical but psychological, requiring him to overcome institutional resistance to innovation while working within a military hierarchy that rewarded conformity over creativity. The clock was ticking toward the 48-hour deadline imposed by division headquarters, and Cookie knew that his window of opportunity was measured in hours rather than days. Cookie's innovation emerged from the convergence of three seemingly unrelated observations that had been percolating in his mind throughout the weeks of failed assaults in the Hurtgen Forest. The first was his recognition of the predictable patterns in German defensive behavior, particularly their vulnerability during meal periods when attention to security decreased as basic human needs took priority. The second was his understanding of how specific aromas could trigger powerful psychological and physiological responses that transcended conscious control, a phenomenon he had observed countless times in civilian restaurants but never considered in military context. The third was his realization that the German bunker system, impressive as it was for defensive purposes, created a confined environment where airborne substances would concentrate and linger far longer than in open terrain. The technical foundation of Cookie's plan rested on principles of chemistry and human psychology rather than ballistics or explosives. During his years in Chicago restaurants, he had learned to create what he called aroma bombs, concentrated combinations of spices, oils, and other ingredients that could fill large spaces with irresistible smells designed to attract customers from blocks away. The technique involved heating specific combinations of ingredients to precise temperatures that would maximize their aromatic compounds while creating chemical reactions that enhanced both the intensity and the psychological impact of the resulting fragrances. The first component of Cookie's system involved the construction of what he termed pressure cookers, though these devices bore only superficial resemblance to the kitchen equipment that shared the same name. Using salvaged metal from destroyed vehicles and standard military engineering supplies, Cookie designed containers that could generate and maintain the precise temperature and pressure conditions necessary to extract maximum aromatic potential from his carefully selected ingredients. These devices were essentially mobile chemistry laboratories disguised as field cooking equipment, capable of producing concentrated aromatic compounds on a scale that far exceeded anything possible with conventional culinary methods. The engineering challenge of creating effective pressure systems in field conditions had required Cookie to apply principles learned during his basic mechanical training, combined with improvisation skills developed through years of maintaining restaurant equipment with limited resources. Each pressure cooker consisted of a main chamber constructed from salvaged steel plates welded together with equipment borrowed from the division's maintenance company, fitted with pressure valves cannibalized from damaged vehicles and temperature controls improvised from artillery fuse components. The result was a device that looked like standard field kitchen equipment but functioned as a sophisticated chemical processing system. The second component involved the careful selection and preparation of ingredients chosen not for their nutritional value but for their psychological impact on human consciousness and behavior. Cookie's years of feeding diverse populations had taught him which combinations of spices and aromatics triggered the most powerful responses in different cultural contexts, and his observations of German prisoners had provided insight into the specific food preferences and cultural associations that would be most effective against this particular enemy. The ingredient list read like an inventory from a luxury delicatessen, imported vanilla beans acquired through creative requisition procedures, exotic spices traded from North African units, and specialty items that had somehow found their way into the European theater through the mysterious channels of military logistics. The preparation process for these ingredients required techniques that bordered on the alchemical, involving precise timing, temperature control, and chemical reactions that transformed simple foodstuffs into what Cookie privately referred to as weaponized nostalgia. Each ingredient had to be processed separately to extract its maximum aromatic potential before being combined with others in ratios that had been determined through extensive experimentation during the quiet periods between attacks. The process was time-consuming and resource-intensive, requiring Cookie to work through multiple nights while maintaining his regular duties feeding the battalion. The third component of the system involved delivery mechanisms that could distribute the concentrated aromatic compounds in ways that would maximize their psychological impact on German defenders while remaining invisible to enemy observation. Cookie's solution involved a network of improvised dispersal devices constructed from standard military smoke grenades that had been carefully modified to release aromatic compounds rather than visual obscurants. These devices could be positioned and activated remotely, allowing American forces to saturate German positions with precisely timed aromatic attacks that would create maximum psychological disruption at critical moments. The physics of aromatic dispersal in forest environments had required Cookie to study wind patterns, temperature gradients, and air circulation with the thoroughness of a meteorologist preparing weather forecasts. The dense canopy and complex terrain of the Hurtgen forest created unique conditions for airborne substances, with temperature inversions and wind patterns that could either concentrate aromatic compounds in devastating concentrations or disperse them uselessly into the atmosphere. Success would depend on timing the release of aromatic compounds to coincide with optimal atmospheric conditions, requiring precise coordination between weather observation and tactical execution. Cookie's understanding of the psychological mechanisms involved in his innovation drew on observations of human behavior that extended far beyond military contexts. He had witnessed the power of specific aromas to trigger memories, emotions, and behavioral responses that bypassed rational thought processes and connected directly with the most primitive parts of the human brain. The smell of baking bread could make a grown man weep with homesickness, while certain spice combinations could trigger appetite responses so powerful that they overwhelmed other considerations. These responses were involuntary, unconscious, and virtually impossible to resist through willpower or military discipline. The specific aromatic compounds Cookie selected for his assault on German positions were chosen to trigger what psychologists would later term displacement responses, psychological states where present circumstances became secondary to memories and associations triggered by sensory stimuli. The primary component was a complex blend of spices and aromatics that closely approximated the smell of traditional German holiday cooking, specifically the combination of cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, and caramelized sugar that characterized Christmas markets throughout Central Europe. These aromas were designed to trigger powerful associations with home, family, and peacetime that would create psychological conflicts between duty and desire that could paralyze decision-making processes. The secondary aromatic component involved compounds designed to trigger hunger responses so powerful that they would overwhelm other considerations, including basic military discipline and tactical awareness. Cookie's research into this aspect of his plan had drawn on his understanding of how restaurants used aromatic cues to influence customer behavior, combined with his observations of how combat stress affected soldiers' relationships with food and comfort. The resulting blend could trigger salivation responses and hunger pangs that were physiologically indistinguishable from those experienced after days without adequate nutrition. Testing Cookie's system had required weeks of careful experimentation conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy, since the unconventional nature of his approach would almost certainly have been rejected by military authorities if discovered prematurely. Using volunteers from his kitchen staff who had sworn themselves to secrecy, Cookie conducted trials of his aromatic compounds during off-duty hours, carefully documenting their psychological and physiological effects under controlled conditions. The results had exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, with test subjects experiencing powerful emotional and physical responses that rendered them temporarily incapable of focusing on other tasks. The moment of truth came when Cookie realized that his system was ready for combat testing, but implementing it would require convincing Colonel Bradley to authorize an approach that violated every principle of conventional military tactics. The challenge was not simply technical but institutional, requiring Cooke to overcome the natural skepticism of professional soldiers toward innovations proposed by support personnel. His solution involved a carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to prove the effectiveness of his system while avoiding the appearance of insubordination or unauthorized experimentation. Cooke's final preparations involved the construction of 3 complete pressure cooking systems, each capable of producing sufficient aromatic compounds to affect an area of approximately 100 square yards under optimal conditions. The devices were camouflaged to appear as standard field kitchen equipment, allowing them to be positioned near German lines without attracting unwanted attention from enemy observers. The ingredient stocks for the operation represented the culmination of weeks of careful requisition and acquisition, including materials that had been obtained through creative interpretations of supply regulations and personal relationships developed throughout Cooke's months of military service. The execution of Cooke's plan would require precise coordination between multiple elements, including weather observation, tactical positioning, timing coordination, and contingency planning for various possible outcomes. Success depended not just on the technical effectiveness of the aromatic compounds but on Cooke's ability to predict and exploit German psychological responses under combat conditions. The margin for error was essentially non-existent, since failure would not only result in continued tactical stalemate but would likely end Cooke's military career and any possibility of future innovation within the rigid hierarchy of military command. November 15, 1944, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed to mock the darkness of the situation facing American forces in the Hurtgen Forest. The temperature had dropped overnight to just below freezing, creating perfect atmospheric conditions for aromatic dispersal while ensuring that German defenders would be seeking any possible source of warmth and comfort to alleviate the bone-deep chill that had settled over their positions. Cooke had been awake since 0300 hours, making final preparations for an operation that would either vindicate his unconventional approach to warfare or confirm the suspicions of those who believed that cooks should stick to cooking and leave military tactics to trained professionals. The German force facing the 28th Infantry Division on this particular morning consisted of elements from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division that intelligence estimates placed at approximately 400 men distributed across defensive positions that had been fortified and improved continuously for the past 6 weeks. These were not the desperate conscripts and overage reservists that Allied forces had been encountering with increasing frequency as Germany's manpower reserves dwindled, but experienced soldiers who had survived campaigns from Stalingrad to Normandy and understood exactly how to maximize the tactical advantages provided by terrain, preparation, and superior positioning. The enemy bunker complex stretched across a frontage of nearly 800 meters, with primary defensive positions dug into reverse slopes that provided protection from direct fire while maintaining commanding views of all possible avenues of approach. German engineers had spent weeks connecting these positions with a network of communication trenches, supply tunnels, and alternate fighting positions that allowed defenders to shift locations without exposing themselves to American observation or fire. The system was anchored by 4 major strongpoints, each containing multiple machine gun positions, mortar observation posts, and enough ammunition to sustain extended combat operations. American forces available for the assault totaled 237 effective combat troops from Companies A and B of the 2nd Battalion, supported by a single platoon of combat engineers and 1 forward observer capable of calling artillery support from batteries positioned nearly 3 miles to the rear. These men represented the survivors of 3 weeks of continuous combat in conditions that had tested their physical and psychological limits beyond anything experienced during their advance across France. Many were combat replacements who had joined the unit within the past month, having been rushed forward to replace casualties faster than they could be properly integrated into existing squad structures and tactical procedures. The tactical plan that Colonel Bradley had reluctantly approved represented such a departure from conventional military doctrine that it had required personal authorization from division headquarters, where skeptical staff officers had agreed to the experiment primarily because every other approach had failed so spectacularly that almost any alternative seemed worth attempting. Cooke's role in the upcoming assault was officially designated as Special Operations Support, a deliberately vague classification that avoided having to explain exactly why a mess sergeant was being given tactical responsibilities normally reserved for infantry officers. Cookie's final inspection of his 3-pressure cooking systems revealed equipment that looked deceptively similar to standard field kitchen apparatus but represented months of careful engineering and modification. Each system could generate and maintain internal temperatures of over 300 degrees Fahrenheit while containing pressures that would have been dangerous if not carefully controlled through improvised but effective safety mechanisms. The aromatic compounds that would fuel this morning's assault had been prepared according to formulas that Cookie had developed through weeks of experimentation, creating concentrated essences designed to trigger psychological responses powerful enough to override military discipline and tactical awareness. The weather conditions on November 15 could not have been more favorable for Cookie's unconventional assault. A high-pressure system had settled over the region overnight, creating stable atmospheric conditions with minimal wind and a temperature inversion that would trap aromatic compounds close to ground level rather than allowing them to disperse harmlessly into the atmosphere. Humidity levels were optimal for aromatic transmission, while the sub-freezing temperatures would ensure that German defenders were seeking any possible source of comfort or distraction from the miserable conditions in their underground positions. At 0630 hours, Cookie initiated the first phase of his operation by activating the primary pressure cooking system from a concealed position approximately 150 meters from the nearest German bunker. The device began its carefully programmed heating cycle, gradually raising internal temperatures while maintaining precise pressure levels that would maximize the extraction and concentration of aromatic compounds from the ingredients that had been loaded into the system during the pre-dawn hours. The process was virtually silent, producing no visual indicators that might alert German observers to the unusual activity occurring within their defensive perimeter. The first aromatic compounds began reaching German positions at approximately 0645 hours, carried by air currents that had been predicted through careful meteorological observation and confirmed through small-scale testing conducted during the previous days. The initial releases consisted of compounds designed to establish baseline psychological conditions rather than immediate tactical effects, creating atmospheric conditions that would enhance the impact of subsequent releases while remaining below the threshold of conscious recognition by enemy defenders. German reaction to the initial aromatic assault was exactly what Cookie had predicted based on his understanding of human psychology and his observations of prisoner behavior during previous interrogations. Soldiers who had been maintaining alert defensive positions began to exhibit signs of restlessness and distraction, with observation posts reporting decreased attention to assigned sectors as defenders found themselves unconsciously seeking the source of increasingly attractive smells that seemed to be permeating their positions. Radio intercepts revealed confusion among German commanders who were receiving reports of unusual atmospheric conditions but could find no tactical explanation for the phenomenon. At 0700 hours, Cookie activated the second phase of his assault by triggering the release of concentrated hunger-inducing compounds designed to create physiological responses so powerful that they would override conscious resistance and military discipline. These aromatic weapons represented the culmination of Cookie's research into the relationship between smell, memory, and behavior, combining traditional German spice blends with compounds known to trigger irresistible appetite responses. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating, with German radio traffic revealing increasing reports of soldiers abandoning positions to seek food sources that their unconscious minds insisted must be nearby. The third phase began at 0712 hours with the release of what Cookie privately termed his homesickness bombs, aromatic compounds specifically designed to trigger powerful associations with peacetime, family, and the comfort of civilian life that German soldiers had been forced to abandon. The primary component was a precise recreation of the smell of Christmas markets in German cities, combining cinnamon, nutmeg, caramelized sugar, and other aromatics in proportions that had been determined through extensive research into German cultural preferences and psychological associations. The effect on German defensive positions was unlike anything recorded in military histories, as seasoned soldiers found themselves overwhelmed by emotional responses that bypassed rational thought and connected directly with their most fundamental human needs and desires. Observation posts reported German soldiers emerging from bunkers without weapons or equipment, apparently seeking sources of the increasingly powerful aromas that were saturating their positions. Radio discipline collapsed as defenders began discussing food, home, and family rather than maintaining tactical communications with their commanders. By 07:20 hours, the German defensive system that had resisted conventional assault for weeks began to disintegrate as individual soldiers and entire squads abandoned their positions in response to psychological pressures that they were unable to resist or even understand. The carefully coordinated fields of fire that had made German positions impregnable became meaningless as machine gunners left their weapons to investigate smells that their unconscious minds interpreted as more important than military duty. Colonel Bradley, observing the assault through binoculars from the American command post, initially refused to believe the reports reaching him from forward observers. The tactical situation that had remained static for weeks was changing with unprecedented speed as German defenders exhibited behavior that violated every principle of military psychology and combat effectiveness. Within 15 minutes of Cookie's assault reaching full effectiveness, intelligence estimates suggested that German combat effectiveness had been reduced by more than 70%, with entire sections of the defensive perimeter effectively unmanned. The American ground assault that followed Cookie's aeromatic bombardment proceeded with an ease that seemed almost anticlimactic after weeks of bloody failures. Companies A and B advanced across terrain that had been a killing ground for previous attacks, encountering only scattered and disorganized resistance from German defenders who seemed more interested in the source of the tantalizing aromas filling their positions than in maintaining defensive fires. Machine gun nests that had claimed dozens of American lives were captured by soldiers who found their previous occupants clustered around cooking fires, attempting to recreate the smells that had overwhelmed their tactical discipline. The final German strongpoint fell at 07:35 hours when its remaining defenders, a squad of veteran soldiers who had somehow maintained their positions despite the aeromatic assault, simply walked out of their bunker with their hands raised, apparently overcome by combination of hunger, homesickness, and the realization that resistance was futile. The entire action, from the first release of aromatic compounds to the final surrender of German defenders, had lasted exactly 23 minutes, achieving in less than half an hour what conventional tactics had failed to accomplish in 3 weeks of bloody fighting. Cookie's post-action assessment revealed the stunning effectiveness of his unconventional approach to warfare, with final casualty figures that seemed almost impossible to believe. American losses during the assault totaled 3 wounded, none seriously, while German casualties included 412 prisoners, 37 confirmed dead from various causes, and only a handful of soldiers who had managed to escape the aeromatic bombardment by fleeing deeper into the forest. The tactical objectives that had seemed impossible to achieve through conventional means had been accomplished with minimal American casualties and in a fraction of the time required for traditional military operations. The immediate aftermath of Cookie's success created a situation that military historians would later describe as unprecedented in the annals of warfare, as American forces found themselves in possession of intact German fortifications, complete equipment stocks, and intelligence materials that provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and intentions throughout the entire sector. More importantly, the psychological impact of the operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation, as word of the extraordinary assault spread through both American and German units with the speed of battlefield legend. Cookie's immediate recognition came in the form of battlefield commendations from Colonel Bradley, who overcame his initial skepticism to recommend the cook for decorations that acknowledged not just his tactical innovation but his courage in proposing and executing an operation that challenged every accepted principle of military science. The official after-action report struggled to find appropriate language to describe an assault that had achieved complete tactical success through the application of culinary rather than military skills, ultimately settling on terms like psychological operations and unconventional warfare that captured the spirit if not the precise nature of Cookie's achievement. The strategic implications of Cookie's innovation extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory in the Hurtgen Forest, as military theorists began to recognize the potential applications of aromatic warfare in other combat situations. Within weeks, specialized units were being formed to study and implement variations of Cookie's techniques, while research programs were established to explore the broader possibilities of using human psychology and sensory manipulation as weapons of war. The simple insight that soldiers remained human beings subject to basic needs and desires, regardless of their training or ideology, had opened entirely new avenues for achieving military objectives with minimal casualties and maximum effectiveness. Perhaps most significantly, Cookie's success had demonstrated that innovation in warfare could come from the most unexpected sources, challenging military institutions to recognize and cultivate creative thinking at every level of the organizational hierarchy. The cook who had transformed an impossible tactical situation through the application of principles learned in civilian restaurants had proven that the most effective solutions to military problems might be found not in advanced weapons or sophisticated tactics but in understanding the fundamental nature of human behavior under stress. The transformation of Sergeant Thomas "Cookie" Kowalski from an anonymous mess sergeant into one of the most celebrated heroes of the European theater began within hours of his extraordinary victory in the Hurtgen Forest, as news of the aromatic assault spread through military channels with the speed of battlefield legend. Colonel Bradley's initial after-action report, filed at 1,200 hours on November 15, 1944, used language that military historians would later describe as unprecedented in its recognition of tactical innovation achieved through non-traditional means. The document, classified at the highest levels and distributed to senior commanders throughout the European theater, described Cookie's achievement as a revolutionary approach to psychological warfare that achieved complete tactical success with minimal friendly casualties. The immediate recognition of Cookie's achievement took the form of battlefield decorations that reflected not just his tactical success but the broader implications of his innovation for military science. Within 72 hours of the Hurtgen operation, Cookie had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and a field promotion to Master Sergeant that acknowledged his unique contribution to American military capabilities. More significantly, he had been assigned to a newly created position as Special Operations Advisor, charged with developing and implementing aromatic warfare techniques for use throughout the European theater. Cookie's response to his sudden fame reflected the fundamental modesty that had characterized his entire military career, as he consistently deflected personal credit in favor of emphasizing the contributions of his kitchen staff and the soldiers who had supported his unconventional experiments. In interviews with war correspondents who flocked to his position following the Hurtgen victory, Cookie repeatedly stressed that his innovation had grown from principles learned in civilian life rather than formal military training, arguing that effective solutions to combat problems could be found by approaching warfare from perspectives that transcend